Hello everyone and welcome to the Flipped collab for Assessment 2, which I keep calling Assessment 3 because I always get mixed up when they have an A1A and an A1B, so I have to keep remembering to call this one Assessment 2, although it is the third of our assessments. I hope you, again, enjoying the choice of assessments. For this particular Flip Collaborate, I'm going to be talking about assessment 2, which is the presentation, but you also have a choice of assessment 2, the multimodal report, so I'll also make a short presentation about that one as well. Now, I haven't made slides as such today because really my focus is going to be on stepping you through the scenario in particular and working through some of the ideas and literacy concepts that are based within the scenario, and having a look at the English curriculum and trying to find some matches and look at how certain literacy concepts are scaffolded through particular year levels, and in particular the 3, 4 and 5 levels that we're focusing on. Having a quick discussion about NAPLAN and then linking everything back together. As I've said many times, you'll still need to come or listen to the interactive collab, because this is no way going to be a decisive or encompassing everything, I suppose is a good way to put it. We'll be looking at some more detailed examples during the interactive collab, so you'll please come to that or listen to the recording. This is just going to be an overview, and like I said, looking at the scenario and looking at the curriculum, we'll give you some more detailed instructions during our interactive collab, which is in week 8. This is a really exciting, I suppose, presentation because you get to use your presentation skills. It's not all about writing this time. It's about you being able to communicate ideas via either, say, a YouTube presentation, or perhaps you can use screencasts like I am using now. We'll talk more about presentation options towards the end of the presentation, and we can also talk more about that in the interactive collab as well if people have questions. So this is assessment 2, the presentation, and you can see that it's not a conventional word limit because it is a presentation as such. So you are going to be talking for roughly about 7 minutes. So when these assessments were constructed, it was deemed that 7 minutes would be roughly equal to the word count of the other multimodal presentation, so that there is an equal distribution between both of them. Now, you do need to stick to that. So it does say give or take a minute. We can't be listening to 20-minute presentations, as fantastic as that would be, because it would just be unfair to other students, and the ELAs would be inundated with too many presentations to listen to. So you do need to stick to the 7-minute time frame and make sure that you cover everything you need to cover within those 7 minutes. It does have a 40% weighting, which I know can be a bit sometimes stressful when you know that one particular assessment is going to make up 40% of your mark. But just remember to, I suppose, get in early, which is why we're making these presentations early this week. We're having interactive collabs nice and early, so that you've got plenty of time to ask questions and seek advice from your ELAs. They're all fabulously knowledgeable. So if you're wondering about something and say, hey, I was thinking about this idea, does that make sense? They can give you feedback on that sort of stuff straight away. So it's always worth asking and clarifying ideas. The due date is Monday, the 4th of Feb, which is the Monday of week 12. And you will be getting a general comment on this one. So it is non-detailed feedback. Just remember that at the end of the TP, it's always hard and tricky to give out longer extensions, so you will need to be organised in terms of that date. Now, I'm pretty sure we already know that we have 2 options, and today we're going to be talking about the presentation. I'm going to skip right down to assessment details and start looking through the main elements of this presentation. So as you can see, we've got ourselves a scenario, and again, we're thinking about ourselves in the position of the teacher in this situation and what it would be like talking to parents, which is something really practical and something that you're going to have to be able to do effectively as communicate with parents in your classroom. So we're going to have a chat with some parents who are a bit concerned about the upcoming NAPLAN test. So our presentation is going to be geared towards the parents. So I think it's really important that you think about your audience in terms of how you explain certain concepts. Your presentation could be like this screencast, it could be a narrated PowerPoint, it could be a video. It doesn't really matter what you choose as long as you've got a means to be able to present. And I find this screencast really quite easy to use, so we can talk about that more in their interactive collab as well. And we need to upload our finished product to YouTube, which if you use Screencast, it is super duper easy. You can actually click on a button that says upload to YouTube, and as long as you've got a YouTube channel, it does it all for you. And I find it heaps quicker than when I upload videos that I've made myself. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So let's get right into what actually needs to be covered in this 7-minute presentation. So we are imagining that we have some parents in our class who are a little bit concerned about how the students are going to prepare themselves in terms of this NAPLAN test that's coming up. Now you can see that we've got some preparation material that we need to look at in terms of the Captain's Chronicle, and when you click on this particular link, it takes you to this particular piece of reading. So in this situation, the students would read the text and then they'd have these type of multiple choice questions to answer, which is very similar to how NAPLAN is structured. So we need to be able to use this Captain's Chronicle because it gives us lots of good insight into English and literacy concepts which are covered, which in things like NAPLAN. So we're going to be using either the state or national curriculum. I know in some states it's the same, and it doesn't really matter this time. So for ease of, I suppose, continuity across, all states, I have decided to choose the national curriculum. But you could very well choose your own state curriculum if there are any differences. You're welcome to use that. It says and or, so you can do, I will leave that up to you. So we need to read the scenario because we need to find 3 concepts that need to be taught across 3, 4 and 5, the year levels, 3, 4 and 5. And that's going to be broken down a little bit further. They give you a little bit more information about that, which I'm going to talk to in a minute. You could locate the NAPLAN marking guide because it gives you a bit of an insight into how writing in particular is marked, and might give you some insight as well into how reading is assessed too. It's very easy. There isn't a particular link for this one, but if you Google the NAPLAN marking guide, even if it's from 2 years ago, it'll still be relevant. So just Google that and find that. And now it's really, really important to think about how we're going to critically compare and evaluate the benefits and limitations of the forms of assessment that we're going to choose. We have to make sure we're thinking about benefits and limitations because the main section of the rubric there talks about the fact that you've covered both of those. So bear that in mind. So that is a bit of an overview on things that you need to think about. But I've found that these particular 6 questions have helped me sort of focus my thinking and think about what exactly needs to be covered in this presentation. So I'm going to be talking us through these 6 pointers here. Again, just an overview. We'll talk and give you some exact examples that you can walk away with from the interactive collab as well, and we'll be talking more about it then. So with number 1, we need to give a brief overview on how the scaffolding of English concepts happens across years 3, 4 and 5 to prepare students for this test. So what do we mean exactly by that? So my thinking is that if we have a look at, now I've gone for the scope and sequence because I just find it visually easier to use, and it's really easy in terms of seeing continuity across particular substrands. So as we can see, all knowledge builds on from a different point year after year, all the way up to even year 10. So we can trace through both the strands of language, literature, and literacy, but also through the substrands themselves. So we are able to choose something like language for social interactions and see how that looks in prep. And we can say, well, in a prep classroom or in a foundation classroom, explore how language is used differently at home and school depending on the relationships between the people. We can see how through the years the progression of that changes, where we're looking at home and school and relationships between people and how that changes, say, into the middle years, where we're looking more at social norms and social expectations. We talk about things like turn taking and addressing and listening in social situations and understanding interactions between people. And then it moves even further, all the time building on these particular skills, where they learn to respond to each other and clarify ideas and summarize their own views and report back to a group, to a very high level in grade 6, where they have to have more complex and demanding levels of the formality of language and understand how to have that conversation with their peers. So as we can see, it's a progression of ideas and a progression of these content descriptors that build on the building blocks, I suppose. It happens with literacy and it happens with numeracy, where you're building each year upon the base that has already been started for you. So we need to have an overview on how these concepts have been scaffolded. So what do we mean by that? So we always have to have a NAPLAN focus. So we're thinking about how these ideas have been supported over the years. So in grade 3, when students sit their first NAPLAN test, to how that again looks in grade 5 is what a lot of time we call the value added. So they would have had their grade 3 results, and then you would want an improvement to grade 5. So you would have that value added of the years of instruction in between. So we're saying that each year skills are built upon, and each year particular concepts are revisited, and each year particular concepts are built upon and strengthened and developed, and depth of the way we look at each of those concepts keeps getting built upon each of those years. And that's what the test would be looking for, that there has been a progression of skills and an improvement to that value added from 3 to 5. So we want to talk just a brief overview about how the skills progress and how they build upon each of the years. You don't need to be too specific about particular content descriptors, I don't think, in that part, because I'd be saving them for part 2 when we get to looking at 3 particular concepts. So it'd be more of a like an introduction, if you will, just stating how NAPLAN looks at that value added and how it's building upon each of the skills and showing the progression from grade 3 to grade 5. When we have a look at number 2, we need to show 3 concepts that students have learned to scaffold them in preparation for this section of NAPLAN. Use of preparation material from the scenario and relevant content descriptors and elaborations from the relevant curriculum to illustrate this. So this is where I'm going to spend a bit of time actually looking at Captain's Chronicle. So this is what the students would be given to read. Now, I'm not going to look at every single question, but because some of them are a little bit similar in terms of the skills that they're looking for. But say this first one, for example, what we need to do is look for the literacy skills that the test is testing for. These blue sections are really, really handy, so you'll need to read them really, really carefully, perhaps print it out and highlight, because we're looking for key skills that the question is testing for. So each question is very well scripted and very well targeted to particular skills that they want to know if the kids can do. So in this particular instance here, where it's got this, the page from the Captain's Chronicle is a persuasive text. So we want the kids to be able to identify the features of a persuasive text when they're reading. So they have to be able to evaluate the information in the text. So that was one thing that I wrote down as being something I could look for, being able to evaluate information in the text. And then more specifically, looking at how this text seeks to persuade the reader. So we're looking at persuasion and we're looking at evaluating the text. In the teaching tip below, it talks about familiarising students with language and text features. So that's also something that could be looked for in the curriculum. I mean, go to find, like if you're in your scope and sequence and you go to edit, find, I mean, you could look for something like, you can see already up here, I've typed in metaphor because that was a keyword I was looking for earlier. So look for things like text features and see if it comes up and see what outcomes, correspond to that. And if not, you're just going to have a look through and see, well, if this is looking for things like evaluating information in the text and persuading the reader and thinking about the purpose of the text, or what kinds of substrands or elements of the scope and sequence are actually covered by asking the students this question. So there should be correspondence to the actual outcomes themselves. So I know that it's not about social interaction, so I can scroll down from there. But what I did make links to was purpose and audience. So the purpose and audience is this one here. So we're looking at how texts serve different purposes and how the structure of these types of texts vary according to the text purpose. So that's absolutely 100% linked in with this particular question. So I can find that this matches very well to these particular content descriptors. So again, we're just focusing on years 3, 4, and 5, so don't worry about early years, but we're looking at how we're going to understand how different text types vary in their language choices depending on the content. That's at grade 3, but then by grade 5 they should be able to understand how texts can vary in purpose, structure and topic, as well as a degree of formality. So that's an area that this particular question would be focusing on. So that element of purpose and audience within reading and writing, students need to be aware of. There's also probably a small link to comprehension strategies, but I'll talk a little bit more about comprehension strategies because it comes up so much. Where's it got to? I think it's right down the bottom, good old comprehension strategies. There it is. So it also has a small link to the literacy strand and comprehension strategies being the substrand, about how you're going to build on in terms of being able to build literal and inferred meaning from text. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of questions 2 and I think 4 as well. So when we have a look at question 2, I'm not going to read them all out because you can read them yourselves, but again, focusing on the blue area, this question requires students to interpret the information in a relevant section and make an inference based on their understanding. So this is looking at inference, and it's also looking at an element of rereading purposefully. It's an important skill for students to learn. It's not just an important skill to learn during a test, although it does say that there. It's an important skill to learn all the time with your reading, being able to reread and reorganize information to put different clues together to be able to give you an idea of what you're going to infer and what you're going to draw from the information. So the key things really with this question 2 is the inference itself and then being able to reread. So that links in perfectly with comprehension strategies, as we just mentioned, because you can see there that there's an inferred meaning that you need to be able to infer in grade 3. Moving on to how you're going to link information and integrate those ideas together by grade 5. And you can even see there it says evaluating text, with links in really nicely with question 1 as well. Oh, the other one I wanted to talk about there was the rereading. Now I'm just going to type here we go, reading processes. So another thing that I thought was interesting was linking to that rereading and looking for different clues in different ways. So if we have a look at, say, grade 3 building on to grade 5 and that value added and the building on and scaffolding those ideas throughout the years, We've got things like being able to monitor, predict, confirm, reread, reading on, self-correcting, and it turns into reviewing and checking ideas, and then it becomes into, having predictions, confirming. You've got skipping and scanning by the time you get to grade 5, so you should be able to skim and scan and get different ideas, having read the whole text, to put different clues together to reorganize that information. So that's another key element, or another literacy strategy that's been used and tested within this Captain's Chronicle. In question 3, we need to be able to interpret language. So it says here that the question requires students to integrate information from the relevant section and interpret the language that has been used to describe the necessary qualities of the captain. It talks a little bit about some specific vocab, but also about how we're going to encourage students to approach the questions logically. Again, they need to be able to restate the information in different ways to put them back together, which also is being tested in the question above. As well as that, we want to, in terms of integrating language and evaluating language, I'm sure we can find there is... I'll have to scroll up, apologies. There is a substrand called evaluating language. So here we have expressing and preferences and evaluating texts. So we should be able to use the features of the text and the language structures to be able to give you an informed decision about what kind of text it is and what kind of, and also links into purpose, I guess, as well. We're using that meta language to describe the effects of ideas and text structures for particular audiences, but you could also link it a little bit as well to vocab, which I think is down the bottom. There is a link to vocab where you're looking at different words and different ways of how words have been expressed and how different words could be used in different situations as well. So getting back to Captain's Chronicle, question 4 is again looking at inference, so you could link that again to comprehension strategies. I'm going to keep scrolling down because I'm conscious of the time. So with this question, in question 6, is where I had to look up the idea of having a metaphor and students using metaphor and being able to understand the different use and effects of metaphors in text by deconstructing examples and shared text. Now, they're not going to have a shared text situation in the particular test, but you would be hoping obviously that this was covered in class time prior to that. Now, I did search for the word metaphor before, so I'm going to go back to that and look up. Now, we don't want to have it in year 6. There was an example of being in year 5. Here we go. So within language devices and looking at how authors use and create different meaning with different text devices. So by grade, they start off with onomatopoeia and things like, different similes and building onto metaphor and using that in different ways and understanding the language and how that can be used in different ways. So again, it's building upon that different knowledge of language and how it can be used in different ways. So all of these, linking back to what it is we need to do here, is that there are lots of different literacy concepts within the Captain's Chronicle itself, which shows you how different concepts have been used to scaffold for this particular test. So you could look at comprehension strategies, and particularly inferring. You could look at rereading. You could look at building on purpose and audience. You could look at language devices. So my point today was just to show you that within the Captain's Chronicle, if you have a look at some of the key literacy concepts which are being covered and link them to the curriculum, that'll give you a good start to sort of get your head ready on how you're going to present that particular information. So now we have to talk about assessment across the years 3, 4 and 5. Now it's particularly tricky because it's quite a big area. So when it says give a brief overview, I think we should honour that and stick to the fact that it is a brief overview. When I have a look at our readings for the week, and we have a look at week 7, which is assessment and reading, it does go a little bit into sort of a general idea of what assessment is, and talks about different formative and summative forms of assessment and how they can be used firstly in reading but also in writing. Now, To try and cover a lot of these in a brief overview, we're not going to be able to get into the depth of talking about specific tools. That comes later. So we just want an overview perhaps on assessment in terms of what assessment is and in terms of authentic assessment and perhaps valuing different bases for assessment. So within that Chapter 7, Assessment and Reading, in our e-text, they talk about, you know, the teaching and learning cycle and how we start off with what kids can do, and then how assessment is going to inform our teaching, and how we use it as a tool to monitor during lessons, and how it can also be used, I suppose, in different ways in terms of, you know, there could be things like formative assessment, which, getting back to my examples, are just more things like informal discussions and things like a reading conference, and then getting into more sort of formal testing. You might have things like read and retell, there's sight word tests, there's different vocab tests, reading tests. There are some examples I felt in the e-text, which are probably a little bit more early years based, so just be conscious of that. You have to remember that it is years 3, 4 and 5. We don't want to be having things, I probably wouldn't suggest things like sight word tests, which is written in the list, things like running records. Students are generally beyond that at these year levels, so we need to suggest things that are appropriate to the particular year levels that we're talking about. So we've got an overview of assessment in those particular year levels, talking about assessment in general across literacy and what is valued. Because then within point 4, we're going to get into more of the details in terms of 3 particular assessments. So this is where it breaks off and tells us that we need to have an assessment for reading, writing and speaking and listening. Now, I am predicting now I know this is a brand new assessment, but we did talk about speaking and listening assessment in previous incarnations of this unit, and I have to tell you that students found it particularly tricky because it's, speaking and listening is not something that is often assessed in isolation. I know myself as a teacher, I would never assess speaking and listening, say, we're going to sit down and do a speaking and listening assessment now. I know you have things like oral presentations, but I find oral presentations are quite contrived and rehearsed, whereas I like my speaking and listening assessment to be much more impromptu. So perhaps during a literacy circle or a reciprocal teaching, or you know, even independent reading, you'd have conversations with kids, and kids would have conversations with each other where they would, you know, you could evaluate kids speaking and listening from those particular instances. So it could be things that are just quite random and sort of off the cuff, like an informal discussion about speaking and listening. Whether you can find a speaking and listening test as such. These are all going to be great things that we can talk more about in the interactive collab. Reading and writing are much more upfront and obvious, I suppose. So once we've got our reading and writing and speaking and listening assessments chosen, we need to think about both benefits and limitations. So we're thinking about some of the things that are beneficial in terms of using the particular assessment tool, and some of the limitations. Now, generally, people are pretty good at thinking of the benefits of a particular task. So if you were going to have a probe test, for example, if you were going to suggest a reading probe test, which is what I've used a lot at school, and someone said, what are the benefits of using probe? I could say, well, what I think is a benefit of probe is that it actually tells you the comprehension strategies that the kids are using well, and tells you what they're not using so well. So if I could sit down and do a probe with some of the kids in my grade, and I could say, gee, Johnny and Harry both are lacking in vocab. So they're generally reading very well. They can use inference. They've got the reorganization down. Something that I'd like to work with them on is their being able to process sort of unfamiliar vocabulary and working on expanding their vocabulary perhaps. So from the test, I'm able to draw information out, which is then going to inform my teaching. So I could put those 2 or 3 kids together in a group, and we could work on some vocab stuff together to develop that element of comprehension that perhaps they're missing. Maybe there's a couple of kids who still can't reorganize very well. So I could get those kids together and the probe would tell me who is lacking in reorganizational skills, and we could form a group and work on that together. Who can't infer? So I just found it a terrific tool to be able to give me the information I need about particular kids in terms of specific comprehension strategies that were falling down. In terms of limitations, we want to be very, very specific in terms, like, really put your literacy hat on and think about the limitations of an assessment tool. Things that we don't want are things that are external, things like, oh, well, a disadvantage of probe is that it needs a lot of photocopying. Yes, it is definitely a disadvantage, but it's not a disadvantage in terms of how it's going to inform our teaching and how well the test does its job of informing us on what we need to know about our kids. We don't want external things like the photocopying. We don't want external things like, well, you need a computer and the internet might drop out. They're not limitations that are going to affect the quality of information that we're going to get from this particular assessment. So always think about the teaching and learning side of things, and think about the data and the information that the particular assessment is going to give you, as opposed to external things that we really don't have no control over and don't affect the quality of the data that's coming to us. So give some really good benefits and give some really strong limitations. In our collab together, we'll brainstorm some limitations and benefits for some particular assessment so that you get an idea of the kind of things that we're looking for. We also want to discuss a benefit and a limitation of some of the reporting sides of things. So we all know about assessment, but we also want to have a look at the reporting in terms of reporting to parents. And this is going to be not like when we report to parents, we give them an official report that's generated. We can't look at those as such, but you could look at things such as a parent-teacher interview or a student-led conference. So it needs to be something, I suppose you could look at a report in terms of analysing the way it presents information to parents. So perhaps you get a report out from your child and have a look at how, a benefit and a limitation of reporting that way. I think it could work really well. I'm going to talk about student-led conferences because I've had them so many years with my own children. So a benefit of a student-led conference could be that the student is there with you and they're getting the chance to discuss their own learning. They're able to articulate their own learning and they know the areas that are their strengths and weaknesses so that they've got things to focus on in terms of how they need to get to the next step. I know that some parents say that a drawback or a limitation of student-led conferences is that they don't feel like they get that one-on-one with the teacher that they could have gotten had the child not been there. So parents still really value that, having that one-on-one discussion and time with the teacher themselves and building that relationship to really sort of understand where their kids are and get information direct from the teacher rather than via the student. So that could potentially be a limitation as well. So you don't need to think about that one too much. It's just reporting on a benefit and a limitation of one style of reporting. So think about ways that information gets to you. And if you're a parent, that might help you a little bit because you can think of how your child's school reports back to you and gives you information about academic progress. And I suppose try and focus again with our literacy hat on because we're always thinking about literacy with this one. We always need to link to current research. So you know that throughout your presentation, if you're talking about the fact that comprehension skills are important, then you link to current literature that's proving your point. If you're giving that general overview in point 3 about assessment, there's lots of good stuff in our e-text that can support you there. Now let's get to the technical side of things. We'll talk more about this in the interactive collab, but there's so much to think about in terms of your technical presentation. Perhaps there are some things I could think about here, maybe speaking slowly and carefully and just making sure that you're speaking really clearly. It would be a shame if you had put a lot of effort into this particular presentation and then your ELA had trouble understanding you. particularly when you're talking about academic things or you're quoting from a book, just to make sure that you're really clear and concise with your language. I think it doesn't say it in here, but I think it's important to remember that it is supposed to be a pretend presentation for parents. So try not to go overboard with the jargon, or if you do use technical jargon, that you explain what it is, because that's only just going to help you show us as ELAs your depth of your knowledge. So if you're able to talk about a concept and then break it down and talk about it in simpler terms, you're just demonstrating that you've got a great understanding of the concept anyway. So I really love screencasts. So if you just go onto Google and type in Screencast-O-Matic, it is such a great way of being able to talk to a screen or a presentation. You could make your own PowerPoint presentation and then talk over it or talk to it. It's really, really easy to load onto YouTube afterwards. You do have 15 minutes for free, which is more than enough for your 7-minute presentation. So there's no cost at all, but feel free to do whatever you like in terms of presenting. You do need to get it to YouTube, so if you're not quite sure, make sure you ask early or ask around. Ask teenagers, they know all about that sort of stuff. I'm sure you've got someone at home who'd be able to help you with that. So they just think about things like your own video camera or webcam. It talks a lot in the rubric about sort of having that hook and having that engagement with the audience, which is interesting because it's in the English curriculum as something that's really important when you're presenting or reading a text, is that you think about your audience and you think about, we really want to imagine ourselves presenting this to parents. So we want to have an engaging conversation. We don't want half our parents falling asleep 5 minutes into the video. So we want a hook, we want engagement, we want something interesting. When I scroll down to assessment criteria, if I can find it, which I think is at the very, very end, we're talking about that, the hook that attracts the listener's attention, and, you give that succinct and clever take-home message. So you're just really getting the parents to think and be engaged with what you're presenting. Other important things is that you have covered the benefits and the limitations of the assessment and reporting styles. It's really important that you've got both in there. Don't just talk about benefits, and that we're talking about those literacy concepts across the primary years in particular, that you have examples relating to that 3, 4 and 5 area. I hope this has helped just to get you started, or perhaps thinking in the right direction. We do have our interactive collab in week 8, which is next week, so we will be able to talk much more in-depthly about some of these things and give you some more specific examples. Till then, thanks very much for listening.